Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's, I guess it's 10 in Second Life time. You can set your sun however way you want it to. Better during the day so you can see what's going on. I'd like to welcome you to the Science Circle. We have some fantastic presentations, particularly if you're new. I see a lot of old-timers here. And to Second Life and to Science Circle. But if you are new, you can go to sciencecircle.org and check out who we are and what we're doing. Okay, I'll get started now, because what we do in our presentations is go about an hour. If I talk too fast, if you want to clarify things, let me know. I'm in voice. Please use text if possible. And let me begin. Okay, today's presentation is on unsung women in STEM. Like every science field, let's define some stuff. What is STEM? Anyone know what STEM? You can abbreviate. Marshmallows, yes, perfect. Okay. Well, actually interesting. Part of STEM is sometimes it's called STEAM because it adds art in there. And I like to think of that because if you're going to make an object, instead of making something that's kind of boring, you can make something that's very aesthetic as well, something that's usable. Certainly cell phones and things like that are both can be both aesthetically pleasing as well as ergonomically correct and very simple to use. I think my dog could use a cell phone if the buttons were a little bigger. So it's a good business model. You don't have to know the science behind it, but we like to talk a little bit about the science here. Now, today we're talking about unsung women in STEM. So what's the word unsung? That may not be a commonly used word. Yeah, ooh, perfect. Somebody, yes, okay. That's right. In other words, people you should know had the people who wrote the history books put them in it, but people who nonetheless made marvelous contributions despite sometimes having difficult boundaries to overcome, and that we should really know about. In fact, actually, there's quite a few of the people up there that I was not aware of. Speaking of which, are there any of the names? There's 16 people behind me in areas of, I kind of categorize them in 4 areas. Computer technology, understanding nature, helping life or improving life, and also pushing boundaries. And there's 16 women up there that I have categorized into those areas. Any of the names sound familiar? You can take a look up behind me. Any names sound familiar? Such as, who do you know? We can pick out some of them, or anyone that you'd like to talk about first. There you go, Rachel Carson. Okay. Maybe you, particularly if you're of my vintage, Rachel Carson and Michelle Nichols. We're both very well known. Grace Hopper, same thing. All my students know Grace Hopper. By the way, I am the department head for Hedy Lamarr. Oh, really? Okay, I hadn't learned much about Rosalind Russell until fairly recently. Jane Goodall, certainly, Marie Curie, Sally Ride, those are people that, as I was growing up, I knew about. But there's several that I think will surprise you here. Let me get my camera turned around so we can do some stuff. And oh, really? The Calutron girls, you learned about them? See, I didn't know about them. I knew about some other groups. Okay, so pick one. You want to take a look at them first, if they're somewhat new? Let me pull out, actually, it's Calutron. And let me pull out the Calutron, by the way, does anyone happen to know what it is? Because I didn't. Yeah, okay, let's see. I'm having a little trouble manipulating things. That's okay, it'll work. Calutron. The Calutron was a instrument for doing for making, let's see, excuse me. Okay, for enriching uranium. It was invented in World War II, and it's one of the reasons why some of the nations who are trying to do it are having may have some difficulty, because it's not the easiest thing to do. The interesting thing about this is that there were, first of all, to get a job as a woman back in the early days was not that easy. There were jobs that you could have, but if you were a smart person and you went to school and you wanted to try to get a job in certain male-dominated fields, it was not that easy. So the Calutron girls, as they were called, I prefer women over a certain age to use the word women. Yes, okay, perfect. I'm actually speaking of three groups right here. One was a group in World War II. One of the things they had to do in the United States was there was a job very intensive job to enrich uranium. The Calutron was a machine to enrich uranium in order to create the atomic bombs. And they deliberately picked women, get this, they deliberately picked women who did not have advanced degrees so that they would not know what they were doing. They would simply, however, they were very exacting, and they were able to, actually there was a contest between scientists and the women outperformed the scientists with regards to proficiency and exactness and stuff in working the machine. So they picked a bunch of women that had nothing beyond a high school degree, that had no idea what they're doing, but were very, very good at making the machine work. Unlike them, the rocket women, the rocket girls in the 50s, anyone know about them? Rise of the Rocket Girls? Okay, so in the 50s, there were women, of course, that did have advanced degrees and were mathematicians and engineers. And they went to work with what would become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for NASA. And they were primarily responsible for helping to develop missiles and rockets that then went to the moon and Mars. There's a very good book out on it called The Rise of the Rocket Girls, the women who propelled us from missiles to the moon and Mars. And then, as you pointed out in the movie Hidden Figures, there were another group of women who happened to be African American who helped NASA in the days before computers, and they hand calculated the trajectories and such of the rockets and stuff, and particularly what was called the three body problem, where you had to have spacecraft and the Earth and the moon and other objects, and trying to figure out how that worked. And if you watch the movie, I would highly recommend the movie Hidden Figures. It's a fantastic movie about what was going on there, not only in times before computers, but also how people were treated back in that time period for being women or for being women of color. Okay, what's another one we can talk about? So in this area, what I placed them in the category of pushing boundaries. Partly because we're talking about the space program. You want to talk about other people in the space program here that help push boundaries? One of the people mentioned was Nichelle Nichols. Anybody know who Nichelle Nichols is or what she was famous for? You may not know one of the things she is. Yeah, okay. Uhura was the name of her character in the early Star Trek. It means freedom in Swahili. Now, here again, as a woman of color back then, she had certain jobs that she could have. One of them was singing, one of them was modeling, one of them was as an actress and stuff. So she started out with Duke Ellington's band. She sang for a Playboy Club once, but she got noticed and by Gene Roddenberry, who was the producer of or director-producer of Star Trek, and she had a character that was, now, the important thing about this was she had a character who was on the bridge of the Enterprise. In other words, she was an officer on the bridge, equal to the other officers there. One of the things about that role, does anyone know how that's related to Martin Luther King? Anyone know the connection? Okay. One thing you may find surprising is she was going to quit the job, and Martin Luther King actually went to her studio, to the dressing room, and said, "You can't." And this is the reason why. First of all, I'm not only your biggest fan, but the other thing is that do you imagine what your role is? In other words, you're a role model. You're not at the time in the United States, the only actresses who were women of color were servants or portrayed in the movies and in television. And now here was an officer on the bridge, equal to anyone else on there, both in the roles she had and what she did in the roles. And he says, you can't. You're not only a role model to women, you're a role model to women of color. And so she didn't. And she, after Star Trek, she founded a business and a consulting group that brought in women and people of color to NASA, including Sally Ride, who's also up here, and Ronald McNair, who you may know also. Continuing with this group, if you'll take a look at Katherine Johnson, can anyone tell me who she is, particularly if you watch the movie Hidden Figures? Did anybody watch the movie Hidden Figures? Yeah, okay. Now that's interesting you mentioned the word she was a computer, because before electronic computers, a computer was a job, much like any other job. And so people who computed were called computers. And she was very bright. Exactly. I don't want to spoil the movie, but she was very bright. She got to work with a group of all white male engineers. It was very unprecedented. And she became so well known and accurate for her trajectories that she was able, first of all, to calculate, later on, help the Apollo 13 astronauts get back to Earth. And John Glenn, in the days where computers were new, John Glenn actually asked for her by name. He said, I want her to calculate what the computer's telling me before I go up in orbit. And he was the first American in space. Very fascinating. I'd highly recommend you watch the movie to find out more about her and her group. Yes, there were, yes. As movies all go, there's some truths in it. There are some things that were compressed in time and other things, but it's a fascinating movie and fascinating life. The one other person in this particular group here is Sally Ride. Most people know of Sally Ride. For people that don't, can somebody tell me who Sally Ride is? Yeah, exactly. Sally Ride was the first American woman in space. We know that the Russians had women in space before. As I mentioned, Nichelle Nichols of Star Trek fame recruited her, or found her, recruited her into NASA as the first woman first woman astronaut, first female astronaut in America. She in her own right had quite a history. She became a professor of physics, served on committees investigating the Challenger in Columbia, and a lot of people, she's very well known among a lot of people because they watched her go into space. Okay, now moving on to another group here. Which other group would you like me to, or would you like to talk about? We've got improving life, improving life, understanding nature, and computer tech. Okay, so I've got a couple things. Let's take a look at, actually, I'll do the Ada Lovelace because of the group here. She goes back as the furthest in history. Ada Lovelace was of the early 19th century, and she's known as what? And you say she's cool for what? What was she known for? Yeah, she's known as the world's first computer programmer. Now, that's kind of interesting considering that computers, it was another 100 years before computers came out. So what did she do? Does anyone know what she did to be considered the first the first computer programmer? Yeah, very good. At the time, in fact, they didn't even know how to control electricity at the time. Telegraph and stuff was just being invented around the same time period. So our first electronic communications and such were being started. But there was a guy named Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace became a countess and became well known to people like Charles Dickens and Michael Faraday and others. And she met a gentleman named Charles Babbage who created a analog computer that is not electronic, but something that you would crank and that would calculate numbers. Now, they were somewhat designed. In other words, particularly, they didn't always, particularly one of them was never built. However, people didn't understand how, exactly, okay, and people didn't understand how they worked. So Ada Lovelace wrote instructions for how the computer would work. And that's what programming is today. It's instructions for how the computer would work. She also was very brilliant in thinking about what computers could be like. In other words, she thought that they might be much like a brain, and she created a mathematical model for how the brain works, what was called a calculus of the nervous system. And later on, in fact, I remember I was in the military at the time, as the Department of Defense named the Ada programming language, and it became the primary language or object-oriented programming language for the U.S. military in the 1980s. So very cool person, well ahead of her time. Okay, does anyone know who Grace Hopper? I heard some people talk about Grace Hopper. Yeah, there you go. Okay, by the way, for Ada Lovelace, her mom pushed her into math and science because she didn't want her to be like Lord Byron. He was a bit of a notorious person. Okay, so Grace Hopper, anyone? Anyone know Amazing Grace? Okay, Grace Hopper was a very well-known person in the later half of the 20th century. She worked on, absolutely. Actually, she couldn't get into the Navy at the very beginning because they didn't want her to go into the active Navy because she was so bright at working in the field she was in to begin with. So she volunteered for what was called the Waves at the time. So she got into the Navy, and yes, she helped write COBOL, or the ideas behind COBOL. She was tasked, when she got as a volunteer in the Navy, she was tasked to go work on one of the one of the world's only computers at the time, called the Mark I. And it was at this point where on those computers in those days, they would break down about every minute or two. And one time she found a moth eating a wire. And so that's where the term bug is for software error, or an error in computing. Very famous incident. Later on, she created a compiler. Anybody know what a compiler is? You'd have to have some programmers out there. Okay, yes. Let's talk about Hedy Lamarr afterwards. But Grace Hopper became a Rear Admiral. She was a Rear Admiral until she was almost 80. She invented the compiler, which is needed for all programming languages. It essentially takes language like we use today, as speech, and it turns it into the type of things that are needed for a computer to be able to use it. Now, here's a person you may, working in the computer technology area here, here's a person you may not know, and I didn't know. Has anyone ever heard of Sister Mary Keller? Okay. Sister Mary Keller was the first person to earn a computer science degree doctorate in the United States. She also helped found the BASIC programming language. Does anyone know how the BASIC programming language and Bill Gates or Microsoft? What's related there? Absolutely. Anyone know the relationship between BASIC and Bill Gates and Microsoft? Okay, anyone know when Microsoft, when was it became a company? Okay. BASIC was created as a training programming language back in the 60s when computers first started getting going. They were big million-dollar machines, but companies and government had it, and they needed to train programmers. So the BASIC language, which Sister Mary Keller helped to create, at that time, Bill Gates was around 10 years old, and he started working with the BASIC programming language. And when, in 1975, when he was around 19, going on 20, he created a version of BASIC for the world's first personal computer before the Apple. It was called the Altair, and he decided to quit Harvard and start up Microsoft in that same year. And so that's how the relationship is between them. What's very fascinating is all the relationships between these things. Now, the other one in this category, we'll complete this category here, is the other one is Radia Perlman. I didn't know about Radia, but it turns out that she created a technology that is required, absolutely, and that's just like us here, interrelationships between things and networking and such. You never know how this conversation right here could jog somebody's or could inspire somebody to do something in the future. Simply knowing about somebody else or sharing what we know about people. Radia Perlman invented a technology. She's called the mother of the internet. She really doesn't like that name, but she's called that because she invented a technology or perfected a technology that allowed for large networks to be able to take place. It's called spanning tree algorithm. And small networks, you can just connect them by things like switches. But if you have a really big network, you have to figure out how to route information around a large network. In fact, the internet is simply a network of routers, and she invented the technology or perfected it to be able to have things like the internet, which is why she's known as the mother of the internet. Okay, I heard, let's see, somebody was talking about another group of people here. Hedy Lamarr. Okay, let's take a look at that group. This is a group that I call improving our lives or improving life. If I read back in, let's see, if I read back what Bebo, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, if I read back what Bebo said is, like Nichelle Nichols, Hedy Lamarr, which, by the way, that was her screen name. She was actually an Austrian actor by the name of Hedwig Eva Marie Kessler or Keisler, and her husband was an arms dealer who used to host Hitler and Mussolini at his castle, and he was also very abusive, and she escaped his abuse, went to Paris, met up with, of all people, the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, got a job as an actress, but she was also very interesting histories for some of the women here. She got a job as an actress, but she was also an inventor, and she helped invent the traffic stoplight, improved version of it like we use today. But her big invention was during World War II. She co-invented what's called frequency hopping spread spectrum, which later on, in fact, I remember being told I couldn't even talk about it in my early part of the Navy career, but it is now used in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. It's what allows us to be able to use Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and everybody being able to use it essentially at the same time is the best way to describe that. Okay, in this same category, you have Mary Pennington. Now let's see, I've got somebody out of order here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, Mary Pennington. Anyone know about her? I didn't know much about her. Okay, Mary Pennington, she goes back a ways. And this was at the time period where universities didn't even think that women should have degrees, let alone get jobs in them. So she completed a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. They wouldn't give her a job. Wouldn't give her a degree because they didn't give degrees to women at that time in the sciences. She went on to get a doctorate in there, but she also was very instrumental in becoming food safety. This was back in the days where there was such things such as ice boxes, and so she invented some of the things we do today with safety of milk and poultry products. She advised the Hoover administration and other governments and the American Chemistry Association, and was a pioneer in that area, but as a bacteriological chemist, U.S. Department of Agriculture, that sort of thing. In other words, probably saved quite a few lives with her work. Okay. Then we have, in this particular category, we also have Lillian Gilbreth. Now, some of you may know who Lillian Gilbreth. Anybody know who Lillian Gilbreth? Okay, who about? What do you know? Yeah, okay, no, that's kind of interesting, is that there was a movie and a book called Cheaper by the Dozen. The reason being is that she had a dozen kids, but that's just the... Absolutely, okay, if you have a, think of it, if you have a dozen kids, or a dozen cats, or whatever, you're going to have to figure out how to make it work efficiently with that many people and all living together. So she became a efficiency expert. She and her husband wrote a lot of books. By the way, the publisher, this was also back a little ways, and the publisher refused to put PhD behind her name on the books. But she did motion studies and studies in efficiencies, particularly in the kitchen, or places where, of course, she was very familiar. And so she invented a couple things which you may not realize. Is one of them is, how did you turn on and off a lamp or a light in the old days? Anyone know? Okay, how would you do some lamps or lights today? What do you have to do? How do you turn on a lamp? Okay. Well, okay, that's right. Okay, how old is the old days? 100 years ago, not quite 200 years ago. Well, that's what I'm getting at, is she figured out, okay, a switch, but you know, some lamps and lights, what you had to do is actually go up to the lamp, like get on a stool and turn off the lamp or whatever at the lamp itself. In other words, with a chain and stuff. So she goes, and also gas earlier. But she said, well, why don't we just have a wall switch where you can turn on the lamp from the wall switch? You don't have to get on a stool, you don't have to bend down, you don't have to go over to it. Yeah, so she invented the wall switch. You'd think we're all used to that today, but she invented the wall switch. She also invented shelves in the refrigerator. She also invented the idea of the kitchen triangle. Anyone know what the kitchen triangle is? Okay, who's ever prepared a meal? Yes, excellent. Okay, that's it. In other words, if you've ever prepared meals and you ever spend time in the kitchen, you want to have the sink, the stove, the preparation area, the refrigerator, all near to each other. And if they're not, it becomes highly inefficient. So she invented the angles and the distance and stuff between utilities in the kitchen in order to make it more efficient. Very interesting. Okay, the last person in this area is Edith Clark, and this is in the area of making or improving life. And so one of the things she did was, what is a cell phone? I mean, it's a phone, right? Okay. In order for it to hook up, does anybody know how cell phones work? Here, I'm watching my time. I have about 25 minutes. Nowadays, if you have, anybody have a cell phone out there? I mean, maybe not in Second Life land, but... Okay, so a oh no. Okay, so a cell phone is, it's a little computer nowadays, particularly starting with the iPhones back in 2007, but it's a radio transmitter and receiver, and you hook up with a cell phone tower, but the cell phone tower is just a network of towers that are connected to the telephone system. Well, Edith Clark is one of the people who invented or helped invent the modern telephone system. She was an engineer, and she worked with a guy named George Campbell back in the early days before the dial telephone. And so she helped actually make computations and helped him to create the telephone network that then spanned the United States and then into the world. Now notice that it doesn't say PhD, because like other people, anybody a caregiver out there? Anybody caring for someone else or knows what I mean? Sometimes when you're sometimes when you're a caregiver, you have to sacrifice some of your life and change your life in order to care for somebody else. And so Edith Clark was well on her way to getting a degree, and she ended up having to quit the degree to go help her mom. And so she later became, later got her, let's see, she never was able to get the doctorate. If I'm not, I may be mistaking it, or I may be wrapping up a couple women together here. But these are often the cases where you have to sacrifice things that you want to do for other people. Okay, we've talked about 3 of the fields, and now let's talk about the area. A couple people mentioned that they'd known pretty much all of the people in this area. Let's start with Rosalind Franklin. Yeah, which my students remind me. However, I would not recommend dropping out to go found a company. He's 1 in a million or 1 in a billion or whatever. Plus the timing has to be there. Okay, let's talk about Rosalind Franklin. What is Rosalind Franklin famous for? Yes, degrees, we often talk about that at my university, is what is a degree for? Because people will often tell me that they want classes to have slightly different twist or content. Actually, she was an X-ray crystallographer. She had worked in different areas. What X-ray crystallography is essentially a photograph with X-rays. The reason it uses X-rays is because it's able to have the resolution to get down at the atomic level, and they can bounce off of where the atoms are. And so she worked with all the people that discovered what the structure of DNA and viruses and other critters like that are. She should have won a Nobel Prize, but she died of ovarian cancer before they got the Nobel Prize in '62. Now that said, one of them was gracious enough, I think Watson, to say she should have gotten the Nobel Prize in chemistry if she had still been alive. And so yes, and so unfortunately she isn't in a lot of the history books, but she was very much a part of all of that in that time period. And she was the one that did the actual X-ray crystallography. Okay, some people may very well know this lady here. Yep, life is not fair. I think that was one of the very first things my mom taught me, was life is not fair. Okay, who knows Jane Goodall? Well, in this case, actually, she was chimpanzees. There were, in fact, I'm trying to think of who the other lady who was the gorilla lady. Anyone remember? I'm embarrassed. I should know her name also. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Diane Fossey. Okay, so Jane, that's right, because Rosalind Franklin should be known, the same as the other ones. Okay, so Jane Goodall, there's several people that are still alive here, and Jane Goodall is one of them. And you have to remember about 100 years ago or so, and earlier than that, when people studied other people, say cultures in another land, or they studied animals, they were, I'm talking particularly in the Western world, they tended to compare to themselves, and to make, instead of studying them and say like asking them or actually studying them in the wild, they tended to compare people and animals and stuff to themselves, and so they got a lot of really incorrect impressions. So one of the things what Jane Goodall did was she actually went into the wild. She'd spent about 40 years, and she would sit and watch and listen, and she found out a lot about chimpanzees and a lot of misconceptions we had about chimpanzees. For example, that chimpanzees are one animal that will kill their own animal, will kill their own species. But also chimpanzees were very smart and sociable. And there's a lot of things that she learned that others did not, because she took the time and effort to actually listen and learn and watch, and not put her own views into trying to describe nature. Very influential in that regard. Okay, other people in this area that you may also have heard about is Marie Curie. What is she known for? Radio, yes. Back at the time, they didn't know what electricity was, and so back at the time, she and her husband, Pierre, who at first worked on it together, but then Pierre, unfortunately, was killed in a traffic accident really early in the discovery. She continued the work, and she discovered several elements, including radium. Unfortunately, later on, she died of complications having to do with radioactivity, because she used to pick these up and put her in her pocket and stuff like that. People didn't know of the consequences of radioactivity, even into World War II, or not all of the consequences. But she also, because of her work, it was very famous pioneering work. Because of it, she was the first person to win a Nobel Prize in 2 areas of science. She was at first not awarded the Nobel Prize because she was a woman. But one of the Swedish women on the committee complained, and so she was awarded the prize. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She went on to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry also. She's the only person to win 2 prizes in 2 fields, with the exception of Linus Pauling. And she continued working. Her daughter-in-law and son-in-law also won Nobel Prizes. So she was probably influential in talking with them. Another very famous person, which a lot of people probably in this group know. And last but not least, we've got Rachel Carson. If you're of my vintage, you probably recognize her name. Anyone know who she is? Who Rachel Carson? Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, she wrote a book, Silent Spring. My wife tells me, and there's a picture that I have there on the bottom right about you can see a biplane crop duster dusting a field of sheep, it looks like. My wife relates to me that when she was standing by the side of the road in Houston, Texas, picking blackberries, getting her dress all stained with blackberries, waiting for the school bus, that there used to be crop dusters like that would come by and spray the area with DDT. They thought it was the wonderful thing. It killed all the bugs. The only unfortunately thing was what? What did DDT and other pesticides like that do? Yeah, the sheep were probably weed-free. But does anyone know what Rachel Carson discovered? Yeah, for one, cancer. For 2, a more immediate effect was that, yes, excellent, it made birds' eggs fragile. The bald eagle nearly went extinct, the symbol of the United States, because of that. And so she was very influential in the development, for example, of the Environmental Protection Agency, of making environmental consciousness worldwide, of study of nature, and one of her documentaries, for example, won a Academy Award of Best Documentary Feature, and so she was one of the first, perhaps, environmentalists. Okay, I do believe that we have covered all of the people that are up there today. Have we missed anybody? Well, now that's very interesting, is that there are a lot of people that I would have put up there. Margaret Mead is one of the names that I knew when I was young. Barbara McClintock. I mean, there are lots and lots of women. I'm glad that you know more than the 16 that are up there. My field has been kind of the hard science and stuff, so let's see. And also, one of you shared me something about Marian Diamond. There's a link to her. Marian is an M-A-R-I-A-N, Diamond. She discovered neuroplasticity. Stopped teaching when she was 85, about brain health and such. Several of you are sharing. Excellent. I just have shared the 16 women up there with you. There's obviously quite a few else. Anyone else know people that should have been up there that we should recognize today? Anyone you know, any women that have been unsung in history that we really should know about? Of course, if you were to go back far enough, you'd have Hypatia of Egypt. Absolutely. Okay, I would like to, we've got about 10 minutes for any questions, observations, comments, etc. Vera Rubin, I'm not familiar with. Can you expound a little bit more? Dark matter. Ooh, yes, yes, yes. Okay. Which I love the idea of dark matter because it's just like about at the turn of the 20th century, we thought we knew everything, and then we found out, oh, there's a lot we don't know. And then at the turn of this century, we find out, we only know about 5% of the universe, and there's a lot of stuff, including dark matter, dark energy out there, which we don't know about. So it's still an exciting world of science, and we'll be looking forward to other presenters telling us more. We have had some good presentations on things like dark energy, dark matter. I would like to acknowledge the fact that today is the Walk for Science. I think, unfortunately, that people want to, here's my, political opinion, sometimes would prefer to have their own answers and simpler answers to things because it's convenient for them, and that back when I was in school 40, 50 years ago, sort of thing, that there was a quest for science and people respected scientists and such, and I'm not so sure that that's the case anymore. I think in some ways we're sliding backwards a little bit. Anybody have any opinions about that, or anything else they'd like to share? Yeah. There's some wonderful advances. There's some things that are happening in realms of communications. Hey, by the way, this is not an advertisement. I just saw it the other day. I was pointing it out to somebody. Facebook is going virtual reality. There's a place called Facebook Spaces. You might check it out. If you go to YouTube and just look up Facebook Spaces, it's something brand new coming out, and we all know that Second Life, you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that Second Life was a marvelous technology for doing what we're doing, where you can be anywhere in the world and talk to each other and share. It looks like Facebook Spaces may also be a place like that. Yes, sometimes I think technologies, much like cell phones, there's a good business model that, in other words, if you cater to the lowest denomination, make it as easy as it can be, where all you have to do is press buttons and click on stuff and things, then the positive part of that is that billions of people worldwide can use it. The downside is that you don't have to know how it works or anything else. And so I think with virtual reality that, like television, is that perhaps that's their model, is that you just have to be passive. Now, if you do take a look at that Facebook Spaces, you'll see that while they're looking at it as a social media, if you look at the longer video, you'll also see that it can be used as exceptionally interactive environment, much like this, only instead of rendered characters. You know, Second Life, of course, is about 10-year-old technology. Instead of rendered avatars, is that now you're looking at augmented reality, and what we're doing here on top of your actual real physical platform. Okay, there's nothing says we have to be here for an hour. Anyone else have some things they'd like to talk about today since you're here? Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I couldn't do it without you guys. I'd just be talking to myself. So I appreciate your interest and your attending. And there's new people, new names here, at least for me. I love it. This is Science Circle is a continually dynamic place. And for new people, I'd love to get to know you more. And hey, if you've got something that you'd like to say, just get with Sean or Jess and tell them I'd like to talk about it. Hey, by the way, I do need to mention that there is a great exhibit on the island here having to do with Women's History Month. Okay, so go check out that. We had a presentation earlier on that, so I'm not trying to hone in on Women's History Month. I wanted to kind of expand on it, having to do with women that you may not have heard in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. I think it's high time that we did learn about these people and what they had to go through in their presentations. Their contributions that help all of us today. Okay, so I'll wrap things up. And if you'd like a copy of any of these things or whatever, I could probably put them all together or have them around. In other words, there are not that many prims, and we might be able to add them to the women's history area or other areas. Okay, take care. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for your input.